2 days ago, on April 20th, disabled American veterans were zip-tied by Capitol Police in the Cannon House office building rotunda. They were holding red tulips. They were standing at attention in military fatigues. They were conducting a flag-folding ceremony for the 13 American service members already dead in this war. 62 of them were arrested. Some of them could barely walk. And the government they served zip-tied their hands and led them out one by one while they chanted, "End the war on Iran." I want you to hold that image in your mind for the next 20 minutes, because everything I'm about to tell you about the 70,000 troops now being positioned for possible ground operations in Iran connects directly to what those veterans did on Monday. They have been to war. They know what it costs, and they are telling you from the floor of the United States Capitol that what is being planned right now is not a mission. It is a catastrophe. Let me start with the numbers, because the numbers are where everything begins and ends. The United States currently has, as of today, April 22nd, approximately 4,500 Marines split between two Marine expeditionary units, aboard 4 aging amphibious warships in the Arabian Sea. The 82nd Airborne's 5,000 Troop Air Assault Brigade has been ordered to a forward position in the region. 2 Ranger battalions, roughly 1,000 soldiers, and the Pentagon has been preparing mobilization orders for additional Army divisions, each running 20,000 to 25,000 personnel. Add it together, and you are looking at a deployment force in the range of 70,000 troops positioned or being positioned for what officials are now describing to the Washington Post as weeks of ground operations in Iran. I want to be very specific about what weeks of ground operations in Iran actually means in operational terms, because the phrase is being used in Washington as though it describes a manageable, limited military action, and it does not. Let me tell you about Koh Tang Island first, because nobody in this conversation ever mentions Koh Tang, and they should. May 1975, a Marine battalion was sent to retake a small island. Intelligence assessed 30 to 50 poorly armed guerrillas defending it. What they actually found when they arrived was 300 to 500 elite soldiers who had dug in, who waited under fire, who moved in disciplined coordination, and who proceeded to destroy most of the Marine helicopters attempting the assault. We lost. The Marines lost. Most of the aircraft were shot down or destroyed. We left 3 Marines on that beach. The Khmer Rouge captured them after we withdrew. They were executed. That is what happens when you send Marines into an amphibious assault on a fortified island defended by people who knew you were coming and who have been preparing for exactly that scenario. Now look at Kharg Island. Kharg Island handles approximately 90% of Iranian oil export capacity. It sits deep in the northern Persian Gulf, far from the Strait of Hormuz that the operation is supposedly designed to open. The Pentagon plans, reported by the Washington Post, include raids on Kharg and coastal sites near the strait by special operations and conventional infantry. Senator Lindsey Graham went on television and said, "Take Kharg Island, control its resources, let the regime starve." I want to address Senator Graham directly. The senator has never conducted an amphibious assault. The senator has never planned an amphibious assault. The senator has never been in a landing craft under fire. He cited Iwo Jima as a model. Iwo Jima cost 6,800 Marines killed and nearly 20,000 wounded to take 8 square miles of volcanic rock. The Marines who took it were the finest assault force ever assembled in modern warfare, trained specifically for that mission, supported by 3 weeks of naval bombardment, and they still nearly lost. The senator is not qualified to cite Iwo Jima as a precedent for anything he is recommending. And here is the specific military reality that makes Kharg Island not just difficult, but operationally irrational. Even if American forces took Kharg Island tomorrow, they cannot hold it. The moment troops are on that island, Iranian drones and missiles begin targeting the position around the clock. Supply ships attempting to reach the island get targeted. Helicopters bringing reinforcements get targeted. The logistics chain required to sustain a garrison on an island sitting inside the range of every Iranian missile system in the region simply cannot be maintained under that threat environment. You take the island, you take casualties taking it, you take more casualties holding it, and then you cannot be resupplied, and then you have to withdraw. And on the way out, you take more casualties, and the strait is still closed because taking Kharg Island does not open the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is closed by shore-based missile systems, fast boats, mines, and coastal defense infrastructure that extends along hundreds of miles of Iranian coastline. You do not neutralize that by holding an oil export terminal in the northern Gulf. To actually open the strait through ground operations, you would need to land on the Iranian mainland, push 20 to 30 kilometers inland on a broad front, and suppress the coastal defense systems embedded in that terrain. The force required to do that is not 70,000 troops. The planning I am aware of from my own professional experience with these scenarios puts the minimum viable invasion force at 200,000 to 250,000 troops. with a Marine Expeditionary Division of 25 to 30,000 leading the amphibious assault, followed by 150,000 Army soldiers securing the ground. We are not deploying anything close to that. We are deploying 70,000 troops into a theater. That requires 250,000 just to begin the ground campaign, and we are sending them in on 4 aging amphibious ships against an adversary that has been preparing for exactly this invasion for decades. The Iranians did not build 31 underground missile cities distributed across their territory because they expected a diplomatic solution. They built them because they expected exactly this, because they expected a diplomatic solution. They built them because they expected exactly this. And those underground cities, those missile and drone production facilities buried in tunnels, where no bunker buster bomb currently in the American inventory can reliably reach, are the reason that 54 days of airstrikes did not eliminate Iran's ability to fire missiles. They are also the reason that a ground force of 70,000 is not a deterrent. It is a target list. Let me also address what Senator Chris Graham said, because it deserves to be examined precisely. Graham said, make a few more weeks of this. Take Kharg Island, where you have all the resources to produce oil. Control that island. Let this regime starve at the end of its arm. That sentence contains 3 distinct military errors. First, Kharg Island does not contain all the resources Iran needs to produce oil. It contains export infrastructure. Production happens onshore across multiple facilities. Severing one export point disrupts the supply chain. It does not stop production. Iran has the ability to move oil export operations to other coastal locations. Second, the phrase "Aang take Kharg Island" describes an amphibious assault against a fortified position inside Iranian defensive coverage as though it is a logistics problem. It is not a logistics problem. It is a combat problem of the highest difficulty. Third, the phrase "Nid let this regime starve" describes an outcome that requires holding the island under sustained Iranian missile and drone attack indefinitely. No military force can be sustained on an island that size inside the range of Iranian coastal defense systems, without a resupply chain that does not exist under those conditions. Graham is not describing a military plan. He is describing a movie scene, and the difference between a movie scene and a military plan is measured in the number of people who come home in flag-draped boxes. Now, let me talk about the generals, because the veterans who got zip-tied on Monday are asking a question that has a very specific and uncomfortable answer. Where are the generals telling the president this cannot work? I can tell you exactly where they are. They are in the same place they have been for 30 years. They are in meetings with defense contractors. They are managing career trajectories that require political alignment at every promotion board. They are producing yes answers to questions that require no answers, because the system that creates American generals today does not reward the officer who tells a president the truth. It rewards the officer who tells the president what the president wants to hear and then figures out how to execute it anyway. General Berger, who commanded the Marine Corps in 2019, published his commandant's planning guidance and said clearly that the traditional model of amphibious assault from large ship formations is no longer viable in an environment where adversaries have missiles that can reach the ships before they get close enough to launch the landing craft. He said this in 2019. He put it in writing. And here we are in 2026, planning amphibious operations off Iran with 4 aging ships that any competent Iranian targeting cell can locate, track, and strike before a single Marine gets in the water. Here's what President Trump said we achieved in 50 days of Operation Epic Fury. He said we destroyed the Iranian Navy. We destroyed the Iranian Air Force. We destroyed their leaders. We destroyed their air defenses. Now, here is what happened 2 days after the ceasefire. IRGC fast boats closed the Strait of Hormuz again. IRGC fast boats fired on vessels attempting to transit. Iran's foreign minister held press conferences because the foreign minister is still alive. Iran's new supreme leader is governing. Iran's missile production facilities are underground and intact. And the planning option now on the table is to send 70,000 troops into the country whose military was supposedly destroyed. You cannot hold both of those things as true simultaneously. Either the strikes achieved what was claimed, in which case 70,000 ground troops are unnecessary because a broken adversary accepts terms without an invasion, or the strikes did not achieve what was claimed, in which case the people responsible for the planning that is now sending American soldiers into that environment owe the American public an honest accounting of what they actually knew versus what they said. The officers who know this are not speaking. And the officers who are speaking are the ones who have already sold their professional judgment to the political requirements of the moment. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is a Fox News commentator who became a cabinet secretary. That is his professional biography in its most accurate form. He is a man whose operational experience peaks generously assessed at battalion level, and who in that role would probably have been removed for cause. He is now directing the most consequential military planning in a generation, and his public statements that following the laws of armed conflict is weakness, that the rules of engagement are obstacles, that the mission is to kill and destroy, produced what we saw when a school was struck and 175 children were killed. That is not toughness. That is the operational consequence of having people run military campaigns who have never been responsible for preventing exactly that kind of outcome. Now, here is what I want you to understand about the veterans who were arrested on Monday, because this is the part of this story that matters most, and that is getting the least coverage. 62 veterans, including disabled veterans, walked into the Cannon House office building and demanded to deliver a folded flag to Mike Johnson in honor of the 13 American service members already killed in this war. They were zip-tied, let out, processed, and the House Speaker they came to see never acknowledged them publicly. These are not professional protesters. These are not political activists who decided to pick Iran as their cause. These are people who have already served, who have already been to war, who already know what PTSD looks like, what moral injury costs, what it means to watch someone you served with come home changed in ways that never fully reverse. Christina Sarson, an Army veteran from Pennsylvania who was among those arrested, said it plainly, "I'm here for my sons. I know the harm that wars do to soldiers. The loss of life, the injuries, the PTSD, the moral injury. That is the testimony of someone with direct knowledge of the cost being discussed in operational abstractions by people who have never paid it." The veterans who planned this protest and went to Capitol Hill on April 20th were organized by about-face Veterans Against the War, Veterans for Peace, Common Defense, Military Families Speak Out, and several other groups. They held a flag-folding ceremony specifically for the 13 American dead. They brought red tulips for the Iranian civilians killed in the strikes. They asked for nothing complicated. They asked to give a folded flag to a congressman and be heard. They were zip-tied instead. And while they were being zip-tied, the Pentagon was finalizing plans to add 10,000 more troops to the 70,000 already positioned, putting Marines on aging ships that General Berger said in 2019 cannot get close enough to Iranian shores to be used safely, planning raids on islands that cannot be held, on a coastline that cannot be suppressed by any force anywhere near the size being assembled. I want to add one more piece of data that puts all of this in context. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran expired today, April 22nd. As I record this, no extension has been formally agreed. Iran has not sent negotiators to Islamabad. The Islamabad talks are, as of this moment, in doubt. The Tuska, the Iranian cargo ship seized by the USS Spruance 2 days ago, is still in American custody with no legal framework governing its status. Iran's military has vowed retaliation. The IRGC is operating on its own timeline, separate from the foreign ministry. And somewhere in the Arabian Sea, Marines are on aging ships that the man who used to command the entire Marine Corps said in 2019 cannot safely approach Iranian shores. All of this is happening simultaneously. The ceasefire expired, the talks are failing, the ships are in place, and 62 veterans who already paid the price of the last version of this are sitting in a processing facility in Washington, D.C. with zip tie marks on their wrists. Let me close with something simple. The Iranian foreign minister said this directly. "We negotiated last June and you attacked us in the middle of negotiations. We negotiated this February and you attacked us again. Why would we trust that talking to you leads anywhere except a targeting solution for our leadership?" That is not irrational. That is the documented history of what the United States did twice. And now the same negotiating team, Witkoff and Kushner, is heading to Islamabad again. And Iran is not sending negotiators because Iran's foreign minister calculated correctly that the last 2 times the American negotiating team came with good faith language, bombs followed. The veterans on the floor of the Cannon Rotunda understood something that the generals in the briefing rooms are not saying, and that the senators recommending amphibious assaults on fortified islands have never had to learn. Wars have consequences that last longer than the press conferences that start them. The men being put on those ships in the Arabian Sea deserve officers and civilian leaders who tell them the truth about what they are being sent into. The veterans who got zip-tied on Monday were trying to be that truth. One last number. Each THAAD interceptor cost $12.7 million. The global production rate is 96 per year. The first 12 days of this conflict consumed more than a year's worth of THAAD production. The interceptor stockpile going into a ground campaign is a fraction of what entered this war on February 28th, which was already a fraction of what existed before June 2025. The ground troops being positioned are not going to have the same air defense coverage that the air campaign forces had. They are going into an environment of Iranian drones and missiles with a degraded defensive architecture on aging ships against an adversary that has been preparing for this invasion for decades, under the command of officers who are politically aligned rather than operationally honest, directed by a Secretary of Defense who learned everything he knows about war from a cable news green room. The veterans on the floor of the Capitol knew this. That is why they went. Watch what happens next in the Gulf. And remember who was on the floor of the Capitol holding tulips while it was being planned.